The most popular of all Prussian military leaders of his era was the Royal Prussian General of Cavalry, Hans Joachim von Zieten. He was so popular that he is even mentioned twice in marches that are still played by the Bundeswehr today. In the Friedrichus Rex Grenadier March, composed in the mid-1860s by the Prussian military musician Ferdinand Radek, based on the ballad written by Willibald Alexis with its popular melodies. Friedrichus Rex, our king and lord, called all his soldiers to arms, 200 battalions and about 1,000 squadrons, and every grenadier gets 60 cartridges. My General Schwerin and Field Marshal von Keed and Major General von Zieten are always ready. Curse, Moors, Lightning, and Holy Cross, whoever does not yet know Fritz and his soldiers. And, of course, in the six-stanza poem by Theodor Fontaine, Old Zieten, of which I would first like to recite the first two stanzas for you. Joachim Hans von Zieten, general of the Hussars, facing the enemy, he did it 100 times. They all experienced how he washed their hides with his body Hussars, Zieten from the bush. Hey, how they beat the enemy at Hennersdorf and Prague, at Liegnitz and at Leuthen, and then blow after blow at Torgau, Day of Honor. Even Fritz himself rode home, but Zieten said, I will first clear my battlefield. Hans Joachim von Zieten was born on May 14, 1699, in the hamlet of Wüstrow near Neuruppin, which today belongs to Greater Berlin, as the third of 7 children to the landowner and country nobleman Joachim Matthias von Zieten and his wife Isabella Katharina von Jurgas. Like most Prussian country squires, the Zietens were not very wealthy, and on top of that, the manor house, which Zieten later called a shack, as a simple plainly built house was called, devoured the meager yields. Therefore, there was no money for school, so young Hans Joachim was taught at home, more or less well. But instead of reading, writing, and arithmetic, he much preferred to have adventures in nature, and from an early age, he dreamed of a career in the army. At just 9 years old, he had already attached a powdered hair braid to himself like an officer, just like Crown Prince Friedrich II is wearing here. When Zieten was 13 years old, his parents had hired a tutor for him, but due to, quote, his immoral lifestyle, he was very quickly dismissed and taken into custody after Hans Joachim indignantly reported his advances. From his appearance, one could have described the only 1.60 meter tall Hans Joachim as rather weak, but he was tough and strong-willed and driven by an unbridled sense of honor. This led to him later, as a soldier, responding to any real or even suspected insult, such as about his weak-looking figure, immediately with a physical attack or a challenge to a duel, making no distinction between ranks. Allegedly, he is said to have gotten into 47 fights or duels. In 1715, Hans Joachim von Zieten had just turned 16, and, as was customary for the sons of the Prussian landed gentry, he also joined a regiment as a volunteer corporal, immediately as an ensign. In his case, it was the regiment led by Major General Johann Siegmund von Schwendi, the Foot Schwendi Regiment in Neuruppin, which later became Infantry Regiment No. 24. On July 7, 1720, Zieten was appointed as an ensign. But although Major General Schwendi, both a friend of the family and a neighbor with his estate, gave the infantryman Zieten a good evaluation, during his nearly 10 years of service, all requests for promotion to lieutenant were rejected by King Friedrich Wilhelm I, the Soldier King, probably also because of Zieten's not very military appearance. And when Schwendi, who had meanwhile been promoted to lieutenant general and was Zieten's patron, was appointed governor of Spandau on January 1st, 1722, and the new commander, Major General Kurt Christoph Count von Schwerin, described the regiment's longest-serving ensign, Zieten, in a report to Friedrich Wilhelm that mourns as a capable officer about whom he had no complaints, except, quote, that he was short in stature and had too weak a voice for commanding. That had only reinforced the so-called Soldier King's obsession with tall men and confirmed his decision to continue passing over Zieten for promotions in the future. But precisely because of the frequent mockery about his short stature, Hans Joachim had developed such a strong self-confidence that he would later even risk controversies with the king. But after his stormy and rebellious years, including the associated bouts of excessive drinking and brawling, he eventually developed a solid sense of duty, which, together with his Protestant Prussian fear of God, became a hallmark of his character and his educational ethos. In addition, he showed a remarkable kindness toward the transgressions of ordinary soldiers, especially notable in historical comparison. He categorically rejected the corporal punishment that was common under the Soldier King, as well as running the gauntlet, and, I quote, he particularly excelled as a disciplinarian of the always unconventional, equally daring, freedom-loving, and difficult-to-discipline Hussar troops through moderate strictness and a just, comradely attitude. Finally, what distinguished the later Hussar general, both in war and in peace, was a relationship of near equality and mutual respect with King Frederick II, the Old Fritz. He even personally stood guard over Zieten, who had fallen asleep after a successfully fought battle. Things were quite different for Zieten under Frederick II's father, Frederick William I. Because after Zieten's fourth request for promotion was rejected again on July 28, 1724 by the Soldier King, with the note that he should receive his discharge, he resigned and returned to Wüstrow to take care of his mother and his 3 surviving sisters after his father's death in 1720. But life as a country squire was nothing for the dismissed infantry ensign. On January 21, 1726, he applied again as a lieutenant in the Prussian Dragoon Regiment von Wüttenau, led by Major General Heinrich Jordan von Wüttenau, which had just been increased from 5 to 10 squadrons, and he was accepted as a lieutenant. But after the hot-headed and sometimes overly sensitive Zieten had deliberately provoked his squadron commander, a captain, and challenged him to a duel, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison at the Königsberg fortress Gross Friedrichsburg for insubordination, which, however, did not impress him much. Because hardly back in freedom and returned to the regiment, he challenged the captain again, which now led to Zieten's final dismissal from the army and his return to the Wüstrower Kalupa. But he must have been rehabilitated on the recommendation of Lieutenant General Wilhelm Dietrich von Buddenbrook, because from October 8, 1730, we find him in the Free Company of the Berlin Hussar Corps, which was being formed by Captain Aegidius Arendt von Bennigendorf from September 30 with 71 men, and which later became the Old Prussian Hussar Regiment No. 2. In the cavalry, Zieten, who was appointed captain on March 1, 1731, felt noticeably more at ease than in the infantry. He also behaved more politely toward his comrades here, at least most of the time. Then on March 1, 1732, when the 2nd Hussar Company was formed, Zieten was appointed its commander with a monthly salary of 50 thalers. But in the summer, he was sentenced to 4 weeks of arrest due to a service irregularity. Unaware of this, in 1735, Friedrich Wilhelm the Verstaarer transferred him to the Prussian contingent in the Imperial Rhine Army, where he took part in the Rhine campaign during the War of the Polish Succession. Here, Zieten found a patron in the Austrian cavalry officer, Marshal Caroly Joseph Bajani, which would prove advantageous for the young German Hussar officer. Because here he was able to learn the combat tactics of light cavalry from the only army that truly mastered them at that time, namely the Austrian. And due to his good development as a cavalry leader, Captain Zieten was promoted by Friedrich Wilhelm the Fromm to major in the Life Hussar Regiment on January 29, 1736. For those who are not familiar with the term Hussars, here is a brief explanation. Hussars are a branch of light cavalry whose origins are mainly in Hungary, Croatia, Romania, and Serbia, which was also evident in their uniforms. In the Prussian army, there was only a weak Hussar regiment made up of Polish riders since 1721. In 1740, with the accession of Frederick II as king, there were two small regiments which, however, were not very respected due to their lack of discipline. After their premature retreat in the Battle of Mollwitz, still a victory for Prussia, in the First Silesian War on April 10, 1741, they provoked Frederick's anger when he raged that the cavalry was not worth a damn, and ordered that women, hussars, and camp followers caught looting should be hanged immediately. However, after changes were made to the previously unrealistic training, the hussars, especially because of their mobility, speed, and fighting power, developed into a feared opponent of the infantry. In the regulations for the Prussian hussar regiments issued by Frederick II in 1743, it was established that the hussars were primarily intended for intelligence service. They must report even the slightest movements of the enemy army. They are constantly roaming the field, can sneak behind enemy lines, and bring back reports of what is happening there. In enemy territory, they quickly provide information about the roads in the area. They are your ears and eyes. The same applies to their successors in the Bundeswehr, the former armored reconnaissance troops, since 2008 called the Army Reconnaissance Troops, according to the old Hussar saying. Hard with the sword, firm in the saddle, the best with the cup, beloved by women, loyal as gold, brave in danger, that's a hussar. On October 3, 1737, Zieten received the king's permission to marry his cousin, 33-year-old Leopoldina Judith von Jurgas. But to stay true to his tradition, he had just before that gotten into a brawl with his squadron chief, the burly and alcohol-loving Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Ludwig von Wump, in which both of them were injured. From the marriage with Judith, which was concluded on November 5, 1737, came his eldest daughter, Johanna, and his son, Friedrich Karl, who died of smallpox at the age of 8. After Judith, who had never fully overcome the death of her only son, died of typhus in 1756, the now 65-year-old Zieten married another distant cousin, the 25-year-old Hedwig von Platen, on August 24, 1764, where he stood out at the wedding dance, quote, for his free, graceful, and beautiful demeanor. On October 6, 1765, their son Friedrich was born, who later became a captain in the Hussars, and from 1800 to 1824 was a counselor of Neuruppin. Another son, Hans Joachim Albrecht, who was born in 1771, lived only 50 days. Albertine Magdalena Eleonore, who was born in 1773, married a Captain von Zieten from the House of Wildberg after her father's death. Their descendants are the Counts of Zieten-Schwerin, lords of Wüstrow. A year after the start of the First Silesian War, which was fought between 1740 and 1742 between Prussia and Austria for supremacy in Silesia, Zieten was promoted to lieutenant colonel in May 1741. He then fought with his regiment, which was often called the Reds and later known as the Zietens, on March 18, 1741 in the battle at Frankenstein, on April 10th in the Battle of Mollwitz, and then on May 17th near the Silesian town of Kurzwitz between the district of Rothschloss and Mollwitz. During the raid on Rothschloss, against the will of his commander, he led his 600 hussars against the 1,400 soldiers of the Imperial Army's General Field Watchmaster, Johann Friar Berengai von Bodefalfa, and was able to defeat them. That was one of many Hussar exploits that would make this light cavalry famous. The reward for Zieten was the Order of Pour le Mérite, awarded to him by Frederick II. The campaign continued on June 10th at the Battle of Grotkow, and at the beginning of 1742, with the engagements at Göding, Skalitz, and Ungarisch Broad. Then, in February 1742, Zieten led a reconnaissance mission into Moravia, where his 8 squadrons advanced up to 4 kilometers in front of Vienna, and captured considerable booty, even though the advance was not militarily fruitful. During this time, the now-forgotten hymn of praise about him was probably also sung in his regiment. 3 cheers for our general, Joachim Hans von Zieten. He is unconcerned about the number of enemies God has destined for him. He rides cheerfully at them and strikes with a sharp saber. Like a storm comes danger, Zieten with his hussars. The dolmens fly long in the wind, the braids straight at the nape. And before the enemy can even react, we seize their front and flank. March, march, you Reds, go for it. And even if horse and man fall, drive the enemy together, Zieten with his hussars. Hussar, hussars! During the brief peace from 1742 to 1744 between the 2 Silesian wars, in addition to the other Prussian cavalry units, the Hussar regiments, armed with a short curved saber, 2 pistols, and a carbine, and riding white-gray horses, were also fundamentally reorganized. From now on, they combined iron discipline with speed, after which the Prussian Hussars were considered the best of their kind in Europe. Zieten had played a significant role in this, and he also introduced the pink standard for his regiment. On July 22, 1741, he became colonel, and from the 24th commander of the newly formed Hussar Regiment, the Zieten-Hussaren, which was renamed Hussar Regiment II around 1780. This regiment remained under his command until his death in 1786. His written works on the training and deployment of Hussar units also received the full approval of Frederick II, and further increased his appreciation for his Hussar commander. But when, on January 12, 1743, he asked for a financial allowance because life in expensive Berlin was difficult for him, Frederick told him, quote, to be patient, but gave him wood and stones for a new building in Wüstrow, where Zieten first had the old shack torn down and then began construction of the new stately manor house. While Frederick II had already introduced the fur caps adorned with a stylized skull for the Hussars in 1740, Zieten had also designed a new uniform for them. From 1743 on, the headgear of the regiment's officers, the Kolbach, was adorned with a golden scepter to which a small black wing was attached. Otherwise, their uniforms resembled those of the soldiers with small differences, such as the yellow Hungarian boots and a fur trim. As for the patience that Zieten had requested from the king, it was rewarded on October 3, 1744, with his appointment as Major General, with his seniority backdated to February 1st. Additionally, on December 30th, he granted Zieten a personal allowance of $1,200 per year. Meanwhile, on August 7, 1744, the Second Silesian War between Prussia and Austria had broken out. When Zieten, with the vanguard of the Prussian army responsible for reconnaissance, his own regiment and the Reusch regiment, known in cavalry terms as the advance guard, had advanced as far as Budweis in Bohemia, he was able, for the first time on his own initiative, to fight a major battle at Moldau-Tyne on October 9th. His regiment was also involved in a number of engagements, such as on May 20th, 1745, in the battle at Jägerndorf. It was probably on this day that the saying about Zieten coming out of the bushes, which later became so popular, was born. During his legendary Zieten ride on the evening of May 19th, he covered a 22-hour cross-country ride from the area of Pachkau, with 550 Hussars, some of whom were disguised as Austrians, partly directly through the Austrian camp, until the next day around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when he was able to deliver the royal order for immediate unification with the main army to the Margrave of Brandenburg-Schwedt, Karl Friedrich Albrecht, who was cut off at Jägerndorf. He then also took part in the victorious battle at Hohenfriedberg on June 4th, 1745. The Zietens had also taken part in Hohenfriedberg, where they were able to distinguish themselves for the first time in a decisive battle. On November 23rd, it fought together with the Hussar regiment of Major General Joseph Törer von Rausch and the cuirassiers of General Hans Karl von Winterfeld, successfully in the engagement at Catholic Hennersdorf. Here, Zieten was wounded in the calf by a shot. After the peace agreement was reached in Dresden on December 25th, Zieten had also returned to Berlin. But here, the peaceful garrison life had made him lax, and this laxity had spread to his regiment as well, much to the displeasure of Frederick the Great. In contrast, Zieten had grumbled and accused His Majesty of not promoting him enough, and had withdrawn from the court to Wüstrow for quite some time. Frederick knew the moods of his general, and at first waited before reacting. He also had completely different concerns than Zieten's state of mind, since on May 17, 1756, the 7 Years' War had begun, which, you could call it the First World War, saw Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and their allies shown in blue fighting against France, Spain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and their allies shown in green. But when Frederick the Great promoted the already mentioned Major General Hans Karl von Winterfeld, the tension between Zieten and him increased even more. Because Zieten, it can be said quite clearly, hated his rival Winterfeld. This went back to the time after the Battle of Rotschloss on May 17, 1741, in which the more senior Zieten was in command, but Frederick the Great promoted both him and Winterfeld to colonel. But in this matter, Zieten had overlooked Frederick's close relationship with Winterfeld, who had stood by him in 1730, when the young crown prince's childhood friend, Lieutenant Hans Hermann von Katte, had been executed in the fortress of Kustrin by order of Frederick's father, King Frederick William I, and Frederick had been forced to watch. In short, Zieten, who had also been suffering from gout for some time and had lost his beloved wife Judith on March 19, 1756, would have preferred to retire now. He then disparaged his arch-enemy Winterfeld in a letter to the king, remarking that he had not contributed to the victory at all, and therefore his promotion seemed unjust to him. However, the wise Friedrich simply turned the tables, praised the jealous Zieten to the skies, but also stated that he intended to continue giving Winterfeld the honor he deserved in the future. When he personally visited the 13 years older Zieten at the end of July to inform him of his wish for him to participate in the war, the old soldier recovered overnight and reported for duty. Then, in the 7 Years' War, his death's head Hussars were deployed in all the important battles, for which I will recite the next 2 stanzas of the poem, The Old Zieten. They never fought alone, Zieten and Fritz. One was the thunder, the other the lightning. Neither of them was ever lazy, that's why it always struck. Whether the blows were warm or cold, they tended to be good ones. Peace had been made, but the desire for war and suffering, the old battle companions, lived through it once more. Like Marshal Daun hesitated, but never Fritz and Zieten. Now it was talked over at the table in Sans Souci. On August 12, 1756, Zieten was promoted to lieutenant general, and then in October he took command of a corps consisting of 10 battalions and 40 squadrons, most of them Hussars. With this large unit, at the beginning of October, he prevented the Saxon army, which was surrounded at Pirna, from joining with the Austrian Reserve Corps and Field Marshal Maximilian Ulysses, Count of Braun, after which the Saxons had to lay down their arms on October 16th. On April 21st, 1757, during the battle at Reichenberg, Zieten played an important role, and on May 5th, one day before the Battle of Prague, in which Field Marshal Kurt Christoph Count von Schwerin fell, Zieten was awarded the Order of the Black Eagle with sash and star, which today is the troop insignia of the Bundeswehr's Feldjäger Corps. On June 18th, during the first battle lost by Frederick the Great at Kolin, Zieten led the left wing of the cavalry, with his unit being the only victorious troop of the Prussian army. During this battle, he was hit by a musket ball and fell from his horse. And on December 5th, in the Battle of Leuthen, it was Zieten's cavalry that began the attack and, with their charge on the open flanks of the Austrians, brought about the decision. However, on June 30th, 1752, during the Austrian attack at the Närrische Domstadel, he was not able to defend the supply convoy of around 4,000 bread wagons intended for the siege of Olmütz against imperial forces 3 times as strong, after which Friedrich had to abandon the siege. On October 14th, 1758, during the Austrian attack on the sleeping Prussian camp at Hochkirch, where the king is said to have also been resting, Zieten formed the rearguard during the retreat of the defeated army. For the year 1759, military history reports no special achievements by Zieten, who at that time belonged to Prince Heinrich's army and had repeatedly been entrusted with special tasks, mostly in Lusatia. Therefore, on August 12, 1759, he was not present at the Battle of Kunersdorf, in which Friedrich's army suffered a bitter defeat, and 3 generals alone were killed. The Major Generals Georg Ludwig von Puttkammer and Georg Ernst von Klitzing, and Lieutenant General August Friedrich von Itzenblitz. On August 15, 1760, during the victorious Battle of Liegnitz for Prussia, Zieten was appointed General of Cavalry on the battlefield by Old Fritz. But on November 3rd, in the last major battle of the 7 Years' War at Torgau, Zieten made his only decisive tactical mistake as a general with his premature attack, which almost cost Frederick the battle. But Zieten made up for it with a successful assault on the Subtitz Heights, and was warmly embraced by his king afterwards. And Zieten, who was repeatedly entrusted with the supreme command of the Prussian army in the king's absence until the end of the war, was also the one who, in the autumn of 1761, freed his king from a deep emotional crisis in the field camp at Bunzelwitz by pointing out to the doubting and essentially pagan king a higher power that would be on Prussia's side. At the end of the war, he belonged to the absolute elite of the kingdom and to the monarch's closest circle of friends. In 1763, after the Peace of Hubertusburg, Zieten, by far the most popular general of the Prussian army, retired from active service. When in October 1778, Prussia, with its declaration of war against Austria, which had marched into the Upper Palatinate and Lower Bavaria, triggered the War of the Bavarian Succession, and Zieten absolutely wanted to take part, Frederick forbade the 64-year-old general from participating, whereupon he remained at Gut Wust with his 36-year-old relative Charlotte Augusta Johanna Louise von Blumenthal, where Mrs. von Blumenthal compiled his memoirs, which were published later. In his last years, Zieten commuted between his house in Berlin's Kochstrasse 61 to 62, which he had acquired in 1763 and which no longer exists today, and the manor house in Wüstrow. In doing so, he enjoyed, probably as the only general of his era, the complete trust of Frederick the Great, who often visited his old father, Zieten. However, when during a return visit to Sanssouci Palace in 1785, despite his infirmities, he stubbornly refused to sit down during a long conversation in the presence of the monarch, Frederick ordered him, "Sit down, old father, sit down, otherwise I will leave, for I absolutely do not want to be a burden to you." Only then did Zieten obey his royal friend, who here granted symbolic precedence to the man who had fought and triumphed at his side for years. But the God-fearing cavalry general Hans Joachim von Zieten, one of the few Prussian generals who had survived the long wars, had by then become so old and frail that he once even fell asleep at the king's table, to which the last two verses from the poem about old Zieten are fitting. Once he didn't like the food, and he, Zieten, fell asleep. A courtier wanted to wake him, but the king called out, "Let the old man sleep. He stayed awake for us on many nights. He has kept watch enough." And when the time of the old hero was fulfilled, once, simply wrapped, Hans Zieten the Hussar lay. Just as he himself always took the enemies by surprise, so death had come, like Zieten from the bush. That happened to him at 86 years old on January 26th, 1786, in his house in Berlin. On January 31st, he was buried in the Wustrau cemetery. While his grave is located at the village church, in 2003, the grave plaques of him and his second wife were placed inside the church to protect them from the weather. In 1794, Friedrich Wilhelm II had the Hans Joachim von Zieten statue placed on Wilhelmplatz in Berlin. Today, the statue, which was not destroyed during World War II, stands at the corner of Wilhelmstrasse and Mohrenstrasse on Zietenplatz, surrounded by Zieten's fellow generals from the wars of Frederick the Great.